going to talk about tests, and as we all know, they may breed experience by having these kinds of tests, but they can be difficult because typically we get the test first and then we get the understanding or the experience related to the test afterward. And these have been some testy times. I don't try and deliver messages that are necessarily contemporaneous with world events, but as we've seen in Afghanistan and elsewhere, it's been tumultuous. And we sometimes wonder what it is that we can do from far away. Like I was talking to Marilyn, wondering about her husband. He's a chief petty officer in the Navy. Fortunately, he is not in harm's way, and he's going to Guam, and then he's going to be eventually back here. So at least he and his sailors are safe, but we know that others lost their lives. So I wanted to talk to you about tests to at least provide some assurances from God's word that he's still in control, he knows what he's doing, and that we will get through this. And it's taken from Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 27. Immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and crossed to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. After sending them home, he went up into the hills by himself to pray, and night fell while he was there alone. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far away from land, for a strong wind had risen, and they were fighting heavy waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them walking on the water. And when the disciples saw him walking on the water, they were terrified. And in their fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost!" But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Take courage. The I Am is here." I believe that there's a window in our heart through which we all see God. And once upon a time, I think in our lives, the window was clear and the view of God was really crisp and really sharp. You could see God as vividly as you could see maybe a gentle valley or a grassy hillside. And the glass of that heart is clean. The pane is unbroken. You knew God. You knew how he worked in your life. You knew what he wanted you to do. There weren't any surprises. There was nothing unexpected. And you knew that God had a will for you and continually were able to discover what that will was. Then, suddenly, the window cracked. A pebble maybe broke the window. Maybe it was a pebble of pain. Perhaps the rock came through the window when you were a child and your parent left you at home forever. Maybe the rock hit in your adolescence when your heart was broken. Maybe you made it into adulthood before that window was cracked, but the rock came nevertheless. I mean, was it a phone call? Like, "We have your daughter here at the station, you'd better come down." Or was it a letter on the kitchen table reading something like, "I've left, don't try to reach me, don't try to call me, it's over, I just don't love you anymore"? Or maybe was it a diagnosis from a doctor, "I'm afraid the news is not very good"? Was it a telegram? "We regret to inform you that your child has been killed in action." Whatever the rock's form, the results are the same. It shatters the window. The pebble rocketed into that pane and shattered it. The crash echoed down the halls, maybe of your heart. Cracks shot out from that point of impact, creating this spider web of fragmented pieces, and suddenly, God wasn't quite so easy to see. The view that had once been so crisp has now changed. You turned to see God, and that figure that you had in your mind is now distorted. You turned to see God, and you couldn't find him. It was hard to see him through the pain. It was hard to see him through the fragments of your hurt. And you're left just puzzled. God wouldn't allow something like this to happen, would he? Tragedy and travesty, they weren't on the agenda of the one that you had seen, or were they? Had you been fooled? Maybe you've been blind. The moment the rock struck that glass, it became a reference point for you, because from then on, there was life before the pain, and then there was life after the pain. Before your pain, the view was crystal clear. God seemed so near to you. But after the pain, well, he was harder to see. God seemed maybe a little bit distant, harder to perceive. Your pain distorted the view, and now all you can see is the chip in that windshield. Now, maybe I am not describing your situation. There are some people who never have to redefine or refocus their view of God, but I think most of us do. Most of us know what it means to feel disappointed by God. Most of us have a way of completing this sentence. If God was God, then why would he fill in the blank? Call it an agenda. Call it maybe a divine job description that we have. Each of us has an unspoken yet definitive expectation of what we believe God should do. And so we say, well, if God is really God, then why? ... And I think you know that agenda, don't you? Stuff like there will be no financial collapse in my family. My children will never be buried before me. People will treat me fairly. My prayers will always be answered. These aren't articulated criteria. They're not written down. They're not notarized, but they're real. They define, I think, the expectations we have of God. And when pain comes into our world, when that careening rock just splinters the windows of our heart, these expectations go unmet and doubts begin to surface. We look for God and can't seem to find him. Fragmented and shattered glass hinders our vision of God. God is enlarged through this piece and then reduced through another. Lines jigsaw back and forth across his face. Large sections of shattered glass really opaque our view. And the shards that are in our hands from the shattered glass cut, and they are painful. And now we're really not quite sure what we see. And church, the disciples of Jesus weren't quite sure what they were seeing either. Because in a nutshell, Jesus failed to meet their expectations. The day that Jesus fed the 5,000 men, he didn't do what the disciples wanted him to do. The 12, if you remember, had just returned from a mission followed by an army of people. Jesus had sent them out, telling them to work miracles and to create disciples. And they created a massive following, and they followed the disciples back when they were returning to Jesus. They'd finished their training now. They'd recruited the soldiers. They were ready for battle. They expected Jesus to let himself be crowned king, and then they were going to attack the city of Herod. They expected from Jesus battle plans. They thought he was going to provide them with strategies. This was going to be a new era for the kingdom of Israel. And what did they get? Just the opposite. Instead of weapons, the disciples were given oars for a boat. Rather than being sent to fight, Jesus sent them to float. The crowds were sent away, Jesus walked away, and now they were left on the water with a storm brewing in the sky. What kind of Messiah would do that? And I want you to note the sequence in Matthew's account. Immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and cross to the other side of the lake while he sent the people home. After sending them home, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. And night fell while he was there alone. You see, Matthew is very, very specific about the order of events. Jesus sent the disciples to the boat. Then he dismissed the crowd. Then he ascends a mountain. And I'm guessing, we don't know for sure, but probably about the time of these events, let's just say it's about 6 o'clock in the evening. And the storm is brewing and then strikes immediately because the sun had scarcely set before the typhoon-like winds began to whistle and roar down the mountainside onto the Sea of Galilee. I also want you to note that Jesus sent the disciples out on the boat alone. Even as he was ascending the mountainside, he could probably feel and hear the gale's force whistling down that mountainside. Jesus wasn't ignorant of the storm. He was aware that a torrent was coming that would just literally carpet bomb the Galilean Sea. But when Jesus sent his disciples on the boat, dismissed the crowd, what did he do? He turned his back on the disciples and went the other direction. Jesus never turned around. The disciples were left to face that storm alone. But I'm thinking the biggest storm of that night probably wasn't in the sky. It was likely in the disciples' heart. Their greatest fear was not seeing the storm-driven waves. It came from seeing the back of their leader as he left them to face the night with only questions as companions. It was this fury that the disciples were facing that night. Imagine the incredible strain of bouncing from wave to wave in a tiny little fishing boat. I mean, 1 hour would make you tired, but 2 hours would be exhausting. Well, surely Jesus is going to come help us, don't you think? I mean, they'd seen him still storms like this before. This wasn't unusual. On this same sea, they had awakened him during a storm, and he had commanded the skies and the sea to be silent. They'd seen him quiet the wind and soothe the waves, and they're thinking, surely he will come off that mountain. But he doesn't. Their arms begin to ache from rowing. Still, no sign of Jesus. 3 hours, 4 hours. The wind and the waves are raging. The boat bounces, and still no Jesus. Midnight comes. Their eyes are searching for their master. By now, the disciples have been on the sea for probably at least 6 hours. And all this time, they have fought the storm and they've been looking for their master. And so far, the storm is winning. The master is nowhere to be found. And you can just hear them, can't you, as you read this story? Where is he? Maybe cried one of them. Has he forgotten about us? Maybe yelled one of the others. Yeah, he feeds 1,000 strangers and leaves us out on the sea to die. The Gospel of Mark adds some very, I think, compelling insight into the disciples' attitude. In Mark chapter 6, verse 54, here's what Mark writes. They, referring to the disciples, still didn't understand the significance of the miracle of the loaves. Now remember, he had just fed 5,000 men and untold numbers of women and children with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And Mark gives this little statement, they still didn't understand the significance of the miracle of the loaves. Their hearts were too hard to take it in. Now, what do you think Mark means by that? Well, what I think Mark means is the disciples were mad. They began the whole evening in a huff. Their hearts were hardened toward Jesus because he had fed the multitude. Their preference, if you remember, had been to send the crowds away. That's what Matthew writes in Matthew chapter 14, verse 15. Remember, Jesus says, well, we can't leave all these folks out here. Let's feed them. How are we going to feed them? We don't have any money. Let them go find their own food. Just send them away. That was the disciples' response to Jesus' compassion on this crowd. Just send them away. But Jesus had told them to feed the people instead, and they wouldn't even try. They said it couldn't be done. They told Jesus to let the people take care of themselves. And I want you to remember, too, that the disciples had just spent some time in previous days on center stage. They had tasted stardom. They had been like celebrities. They had rallied crowds. They had recruited an army. There were, no doubt, probably thoughts where they were pretty proud of themselves, and maybe with their heads just a little bit swollen. And that's why they could tell Jesus, just send them away. But Jesus didn't send them away. Instead, he chose to bypass the very reluctant disciples and use the faith of an anonymous kindergartner. What the disciples said couldn't be done was done in spite of them, not through them. So they pouted. They sulked. Rather than being amazed by the miracle, they were made mad at the miracle worker. After all, they'd felt foolish passing out the very bread that they said could not be multiplied. Add to that Jesus' command to go to the boat when they wanted to go to battle, and maybe it's a little easier to understand why these guys were just a little steamed. Further, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, they're all fishermen. They've been in storms like this before. The sea is their life. They know the havoc that these gale force winds can work. They had seen the splintered hulls float to shore. They'd attended funerals of colleagues. They know, perhaps better than anyone else in that boat, that this night could be their last. But finally, Jesus appears. Matthew chapter 14, verse 15, about 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came walking to them on the water. Jesus came. Jesus finally came. But between verse 24, being thrashed by all the waves, and verse 25, when Jesus appears, 1,000 questions had likely been asked during what seemed for the fishermen a lifetime. And church, maybe you know the angst of being suspended sometimes in life between verses 24 and verses 25. Maybe you're riding a storm, searching the coastline for a light, a glimmer of hope. You know that Jesus knows what you're going through. You know that he's aware of your storm. But as hard as you look to find him, you can't see him. Maybe your heart, like the disciples' hearts, has been hardened by unmet expectations. Your pleadings for help are salted with pretty angry questions, because you know what storms in your life have done. Storms attack your faith, don't they? Storms destroy. Storms come at you like a missile. Storms usher in the night, and storms bring questions. Questions like, where's God in all of this? And why would he do this? Why would he allow this to happen? And frankly, each day can seem like a pop quiz. And some seasons feel more like final examinations. Brutal, sudden pitfalls of stress or sickness or sadness. So what's the purpose then of these tests? The Apostle James, Jesus' half-brother, said this in James chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. For when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. So let it grow. For when your endurance is fully developed, you will be strong in character and ready for anything. Tests. They're in progress. Do not disturb. It's possible that this particular chapter in your life may look like rehab, or it may smell like unemployment, or even sound a lot like a hospital. But don't remember, you're in training. God hasn't forgotten about you. It's just the opposite, actually. He's chosen to train you. So trust in his training. And then thank him in advance for the results. For a life that's ready for anything, including the kingdom to come. Don't lose your perspective. We can spend hours on our phones and in front of our computers and looking at havoc occurring around the world, occurring in our own country. The divide that's been created because of politics and everything else, whether it's COVID and getting vaccinated or not getting vaccinated. As most of you know, I'm an attorney. And so we, as attorneys, we argue, but that's the legal word of art that I'm using. In other words, I represent a client and I advocate my client's case to the judge. The other opposing counsel does the same for his client, and you allow the man or the woman wearing the black robes to make the call, kind of like an umpire. That's called argument. And I remember growing up, you could be a Republican and be a Democrat and have arguments regarding policy and decisions and general ideas about the way the country should go. And people could still live together peaceably. Unfortunately, of late, we've seemed to have lost our way. And we can't do that. Because as soon as you express an opinion, if the person to whom you're expressing that opinion doesn't like your opinion, then they just reduce it to name calling. You can never engage in a conversation. And that seems just so futile to a lot of us. But you know, one thing that we can do, we can pray. Because prayer changes things. And we can know that even though we're being tested, God is preparing us so we can be prepared for anything. And we've seen some things in the past several weeks that are very scary. And you think, can anything get worse? I'm thinking it can. So trust in this training that's going on, because you're being trained to be ready for anything. And so when you leave this building today, I hope that you're encouraged to know that, no, being tested is not a happy moment. It's difficult. It's gut-wrenching. It's painful. But there is a point to it and a purpose to it and an outcome of which you can be absolutely assured. And most importantly, you know people who could hear some good news. That they could be told that the stuff that they're going through, they may not understand, but there's a God in control. And then they'll say, well, I don't believe in God. Well, then share your faith with them. You don't have to be a preacher. You can just share your life. Like I've told you many times before, and probably many of you have read, that sometimes the way you live your life is the only sermon anybody will ever hear. So live your life purposefully. Live your life intentionally. But don't forget that people alongside you with whom you may come into contact could use some positive news. And that is, there is a God who loves them, who sent his son to die for them, so that through his death and his burial and his resurrection, we can, through baptism, walk in newness of life and live with him forever. That's a great outcome. So, be encouraged this week. Be encouraged. And I've picked a song, What a Friend We Have in Jesus, because we do. The disciples thought their friend had left them to die. Jesus knew full well what he was going to do, tested their faith. And do you not think that that incident on the Galilean Sea didn't have a galvanizing effect for a lot of those disciples through the rest of their life? Remember, John, when we were out there on the Galilean Sea and Peter thought once he saw Jesus, he'd do a little water walking? Boy, remember that time? And it's those memories of God being faithful that reminds us that he will be faithful still.